This bill is a good bill, Mr Speaker, and I commend the bill to the House.
I call Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. I had hoped to start my contribution with the things that New Zealand First agreed with, but unfortunately I'm going to have to get sidetracked a bit and correct some of the anomalies in the information provided by the government members. And this is what happens when you pass speech notes between each other. The same wrong information gets repeated. So I'm not sure if the government members have bothered to read the student loan scheme report that their own officials put together for 2012, and if they would like to go and have a look on page 35, I think they'll find that what we're talking about is debt that has been unpaid for a period of over 5 years. It values to $284 million. There are 33,000 New Zealanders that we're talking about. 3,000 of them are currently still residing in New Zealand, so that gives us 30,000 New Zealanders who are based overseas. 14% of that outstanding amount are to borrowers who took out their loans in 1992. So if we just put some real facts and figures on the table, and perhaps I could always get a copy of the report for the government members if they'd like to read the facts. Of course, Ms Barry wouldn't want to read the facts. The other thing too we need to correct is Minister Todd McClay said that these powers would only be used when all other methods were exhausted. If I take the bill and turn to page 6 of the bill, it is in part 162B, clause 3. To avoid doubt, the court may make an order under subsection 2 even if the Commissioner is able to recover the debt by other means. So in other words, it specifically says that an arrest warrant can be sought even if there are other means to gain this debt, to secure this debt. So let's just put that on the record for the Minister. I can send him a copy of that highlighted as well. One other little thing before I get on to New Zealand's first major contribution is there is nothing as annoying as an arrogant government who decides that legislation will be passed prior to it even having first reading. This is an excerpt from StudyLink today, and it says, going overseas, from the 1st of April 2014, Inland Revenue will be able to request an arrest warrant for borrowers who knowingly default on their overseas-based repayment obligation and are about to leave New Zealand. Now, why on earth would we bother with democracy, I would ask you, if you can tell your government department before a bill even has a reading in this House that to put up the legislation that you're going to push through, regardless of any submission, regardless of any comment or any common sense that might be placed in front of you. So, back to the beginning. New Zealand First does have some things inside this legislation that we agree with. Although it's very interesting that since the introduction in 1992 of the student loan scheme, there's been 15 major amendments to this bill. And so I don't think that it's any wonder that New Zealand citizens sometimes get a bit confused about the process by which they are able to pay back and fulfil their payment responsibilities. New Zealand First has no issue with the small amendment proposed to section 1110 of the Act that retains a constant amount of loan repayment as opposed to the current decreasing loan repayment amount. Unlike my colleague Ms Walker, having been a previous debt collector and credit controller, I can see that there is actually a win-win situation out of this, where the borrower has the early removal of a burden of debt and the lender has faster access to those funds for re-lending. Now, New Zealand First also has no issue with sharing of contact details between the Department of Internal Affairs and the Commissioner of Inland Revenue. In fact, again, I would have to say that if this ability had been placed inside legislation a lot earlier, we wouldn't be looking at 30,000 people overseas, because we would have actually been interacting with them earlier. We wouldn't have allowed 5 years to pass before we even decided to start talking to these people appropriately, and we wouldn't have $284 million worth of defaulted debt right now. New Zealand First agrees that if you have a debt, a fair, reasonable and legitimate debt, then the responsible action is to repay that debt. But one cannot get blood out of a stone, Mr Speaker. So it is with great sadness that New Zealand First will be unable to support this bill at its first reading because of the inclusion of what is an incredibly blunt instrument which would allow New Zealand students, graduates, citizens, because not all people with a debt that have gone overseas, particularly in this economic environment, are actually graduates. Not all of them are university students. Many of them have been to a uni-tech. They've got a study-linked loan and they've had to leave the country for other reasons. This is a Dickensian step, sir, and it's appropriate to mention Dickens because his father was sent to a debtor's prison. Now, back in the day, prior to the Debtors Act of 1869, this was abolished and imprisonment for debt was abolished and it was replaced by bankruptcy law. Now, no one could argue that our citizens were not able to travel as much as they can now to avoid debt. But I would counter that argument, sir, with the fact that with the invention of the internet, credit ratings can also travel. New Zealand First can see no practical sense in waiting for the defaulting borrower to return home one day from foreign shores and hope that they have $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 on them when they get to the exit gate, or we're going to send them to jail. Especially when there are so many other options available to the government. More modern, sophisticated ways of affecting a defaulter's life no matter where they are in the world. We refer to the listing of these individuals onto international credit rating agencies so that no matter where they are in the world, when they go to purchase a car or buy a home or get a store card, their account will be tagged that they owe the New Zealand government. Over a certain material threshold, this will affect their ability to borrow and to purchase, which is a more immediate incentive to pay off or come to an arrangement so that that tag can be removed. New Zealand First also points to the other methods already available to the government. An example would be the provisions that are currently available in the Customs and Excise Act 1996. If one looks at Clause 280D-H, Customs and the Department, and this could include the Department of Inland Revenue, can facilitate the exchange of information on the date in which the person arrives in New Zealand, just as they can upon the departure of that individual. Would it not be smarter to intercept the defaulter on their way into the country so to have a greater opportunity to set in place a payment structure prior to their wishing to depart? This is supposed to be about helping our citizens meet their obligations, because there is an obligation on the lender, just as there is on the borrower, to make sure that a relationship is created that is easy and that works for both sides without disadvantaging both sides. These are New Zealanders and they are not criminals. Today, these people are students who have been driven overseas by the lack of opportunity offered for employment in their own nation. At the very worst, these citizens are guilty of breaking a contract to repay. So if we're going to allow these citizens to be arrested for breaking a contract about debt, will we allow banks to imprison mortgagee defaulters? What about the Farmers Trading Company or GE Money? Are we looking at a future where, with our last debtors' prison in Dunedin, which was shut in the 1860s, needing to be reopened to house all those that find themselves unable to pay? It would appear that part of the motivation for this draconian step is the idea that all these students are living in the lap of luxury, laughing as they rip off the New Zealand taxpayer. I can find no documentation to support this. Perhaps this group of people is hanging out with the children of millionaires in our universities, which is the reason Michael Woodhouse recently gave to all our students having to gain a debt to learn. Or perhaps they're related to the millionaire gold card holders that riding for free on the Waiheke Island ferry, which is another myth that this government likes to put out to justify charging our citizens. In reality, according to the Student Loan Scheme Annual Report 2012 on page 32, compliance by overseas borrowers around payment has increased by 20.5% since the amendments made to this bill in 2012. And the increase in the number of overseas borrowers with a repayment obligation rose from 42% to 64% in the 2010-2011 year due to a large number of borrowers having come to the end of their repayment holiday. Sir, the government needs to look at its figures.
Mr. Speaker.
I call John Hayes.
Mr Speaker, that was a particularly interesting intervention from the member from the New